Hello, and welcome to Replay Value. I have a solution to my arc-based versus episode-based analysis schema that I've been toying with since concluding my episode 1 analyses. Because I want to highlight why certain moments in episodes are great that reach their conclusions later in the mystery that they're setting up or are a part of, without spoiling said conclusions that happen 3 episodes or in one case 20 episodes later. To do this, I'm going to handle the arc mysteries in singular videos, like this one, which will tackle the broad strokes of an arc, going through the themes, the character growth, that kind of thing, and then go back and do my usual episodic / scene-based detail-oriented work in their own episodes. So this video will be tackling episodes 2 through 5 of Hyouka, what I consider to be the core of the Sekitani Jun mystery, also known as the Origins of Hyouka mystery. And then my next Hyouka video will be talking about episode 2 specifically. I think this is the best way to tackle the content, as to clearly identify the key narrative thread of an arc, and also to get into the fun and specific details of a scene. Thankfully, Hyouka isn't coy about telling us where the narrative thread starts and stops, since the beginning of episode 2 begins with the letter from Tomoe to Hotaro, and the ending of episode 5 is the letter from Hotaro to Tomoe in response. I love bookends like this, because it's a clear tie between 2 segments, making you consider the opening moment through the lens of the final moment. Keys the viewer in that everything in between is part of one continuum that you should consider in totality, even between scenes that seemingly have nothing in common, and it makes my job of saying that this arc goes from episode 2 to episode 5 a lot easier than having to prove that an episode whose focus is mostly foreshadowing and more introductions is actually a part of the arc itself. And there is a lot of great foreshadowing in the second episode. We get the first appearance of the word Kanya Fest to introduce the culture festival, a discussion of the kanji that's used for that word, and then it disappears as though it was simply a throwaway discussion to build time into the episode. The object in question for the mystery is a copy of the school's history, and after we meet the librarian, she's keenly aware that the library doesn't have the copies of the anthology, and is pleasantly surprised to see the Classics Club still around. But the key element of foreshadowing, at least in a thematic sense, is the question that Hotaro is forced to ask himself after the mystery is solved. Why is he different than Chitanda, Satoshi, and Mayaka? Why does he exist in this gray life, as Satoshi has called it in the past? Is his desire to conserve energy getting in the way of him enjoying his high school life, as those 3 seem to? Episode 2 sets the stage for that critical question of why Hotaro is different from his classmates, and episode 3 gives us the mystery that is going to answer that question. Finally, we're introduced to the personal reason that Chitanda joined the Classics Club for, the circumstances around her uncle, Sekitani Jun, and the anthology he helped to create, called Hyouka. Specifically, why him answering a question about the work caused a young Chitanda to cry. The whole cafe scene is unbelievably well done. We'll be talking a lot about it in an upcoming video. But the first key point is that Hotaro does not want to help her with the search because it goes against his desire to avoid wasting energy. He flat out refuses her request because he's of the opinion that this is something too important to her, and that there's no way someone like him should take on such a responsibility. He can't, as he did in episodes 1 and 2, find a solution that would satisfy her curiosity. Instead, he would have to find the truth in this case. But as Hotaro looks at Chitanda's despair, he visualizes a younger version of her digging in the sand as he sits by, unmoving. And Tomoe's letter, specifically the words, "You don't have anything better to do anyway, right?" are the extra motivation he needs to assist Chitanda, a combination of the 2 girls who have pushed and dragged him into using energy. So the questions of what happened to Sekitani Jun and what he said become the mystery that our protagonists strive to solve over the course of the arc. And while the answers to those questions are interesting, it's not as interesting as the conversation that Satoshi and Hotaro have at the start of episode 4. As they're biking to Chitanda's mansion, Hotaro comments that Satoshi looks like he's having fun, which Satoshi takes to mean about the biking. Hotaro clarifies that he means Satoshi's high school life, which Satoshi immediately gets a little bit tired of as he says, back to that rose-colored stuff. The following discussion has Satoshi explaining that he is shocking pink, and that he cannot be dyed rose-colored. Hotaro asks how he can be sure, meaning that since Satoshi is expending so much energy on things like the executive, committee, and sewing club, how isn't he being dyed? The answer is that Satoshi is himself regardless of what he does. He doesn't have to be dyed rose-colored because he'll always be shocking pink. Hotaro, Satoshi says again, is gray, which is notably different from colorless, which would be demeaning. Gray at least has shades to it, but colorless is just empty. We've seen Hotaro be forced to expend energy on things, which wouldn't be an example of him being dyed, because his motto states that if he has to do something, he'll do it quickly. The Silk Spider and tricking the Wall newspaper club in episode 3 are an attempt to stick to that motto, not wanting to go to the music room and not wanting to explore the whole school, both of which would exert more energy. So you would suspect, going into the sharing of information and theories at Chitanda's mansion, that Hotaro would balk at an attempt to solve the mystery. There's no obligation. He even says, "Do I really have to do this?" as he's considering the matter of going through the motions of the format they laid out. And as he comes to the conclusion that he's not going to, rain clouds roll in. As I said in my previous Hyouka video, a rainy day is set up as the counterbalance to a rose-colored life, which visually makes sense. Compare grayer and more neutral tones to sunsets and deeper shades. It's far from surprising that this decision to stay gray would be accompanied by this visual representation of that very choice. But there is a critical change in the calculation here, and that's that Hotaro stumbles upon Chitanda's room and sees how much work she's been putting in. And almost as though it's a callback to the conversation in the cafe with little Chitanda digging holes, Hotaro comes to the conclusion that he's got nothing else better to do. So why not attempt to find a theory? It's Chitanda's passion and desire to solve the mystery that inspires Hotaro to take the next step into getting a working thesis. So we have him expending this extra energy, the opposite of a gray life, while in the rain, tiring himself out in the process. This is the first example of Hotaro expending energy by his own choice, him being dyed in a rose-colored shade for the first time. The beginning of episode 5 is one of my absolute favorite moments in the series. And again, we'll talk more about the direction of the scene in another video, but for now let's talk about the thematics. As Hotaro and Satoshi walk home in the rain, Satoshi comments that Hotaro has solved quite a few mysteries for Chitanda's sake, which Hotaro clarifies instead that it's her fault. Satoshi points out that Hotaro didn't have to solve this mystery, that he could have quit, as he was originally planning to, and that no one would have forced him to. And as the rain dissipates, Hotaro responds to this by saying that he's tired of being gray, and references Chitanda, Mayaka, and Satoshi's efforts as making him desire to try out wasting some energy on a theory, that his gray life has basically become boring, and that the grass looks greener on the side that they're on. Hotaro, did you desire a rose-colored life? Maybe. Hotaro says, biking away. This moment of self-reflection is the answer to the question posed in episode 2. The reason why Hotaro hasn't been like them is because he simply hasn't allowed himself to be. He just wants to rest. But his existence since entering the Classics Club has instead made him feel restless, as though he's missing out on something because of the way he's chosen to live his life. So Hotaro is still right. It is Chitanda's fault. But the reason why he presented a theory is because he wanted to try out this rose-colored life, if only for a moment. Hotaro obviously remains unsure about that direction for his life, just as he was in the second mystery of episode 1. But after this moment, it would seem as though the answer is obvious. A rose-colored life is better. But the full solution to the Sekitani Jun mystery makes that answer a little less straightforward. We're pretty far into this video for me to not have actually spoken about the mystery itself, but there was a lot of prep before we got into it. The background of the story, as Chitanda tells it in the cafe, is pretty straightforward. We learn that Chitanda's uncle was involved in the Classics Club, and that when she asked him about Hyouka, his answer caused her to cry. But the interesting thing that Chitanda says is, "I may have seen something of my uncle in you," to Hotaro, in regard to him being able to answer her questions as Sekitani Jun used to. But it creates a clear connection between the two characters as we explore Sekitani Jun's past throughout the show. After Hotaro presents his theory of Sekitani Jun sacrificing himself willingly, Hotaro considers whether he wants to be rose-colored, and what it even means to be rose-colored. He makes the assumption that Sekitani Jun wouldn't have regretted his decision, one of his flaws in deduction, because he assumes that Sekitani Jun was living a rose-colored life, not considering the possibility that Sekitani Jun was more like Hotaro and living a gray one, which again asks the question of what does it mean to be rose-colored anyway, which is answered in part by this very mystery. When Chitanda, Mayaka, and Hotaro present their theories, they're all very light-hearted and positive. They portray Sekitani Jun as a noble hero, someone who had real belief in their convictions and struck out against a bad element. Their rose-colored lens, or desire to not have Chitanda's uncle be a bad person, influences their theories. Hotaro asks the librarian whether Sekitani Jun was expelled from the high school after fulfilling the pinnacle of a rose-colored life. And the answer, of course, is, well, actually, it's pretty complicated. It's clear that the librarian feels a lot of bitterness about the past. Her flashbacks are dark and muddy, lots of browns. It's a stark contrast to the start of the flashback, with bright colors in almost a kaleidoscope structure. It's not as though the librarian isn't a reliable narrator, but her perspective is to some degree tainted by the outcome, as shown when she complains that they were acting like children, who have a toy taken away and then throw a fit. And Mayaka seemingly notes this as well. The librarian is also now a part of the school's administration, which also colors her perspective. But it's clear that the answer to the question of whether Sekitani Jun sacrificed himself for the student body is no. He was sacrificed by his classmates. The question of whether he achieved the pinnacle of a rose-colored life, according to the librarian, would seem to be no. And his response to Chitanda after she asks about Hyouka shows that he has clear regrets about what happened in the past. But what does it mean to live a rose-colored life? Without the answer to that question, we can't possibly know whether he reached the pinnacle of it or not. I believe Chitanda gives us part of the answer at the end of episode 5, when she explains that she might not have cared about the mystery 10 years from now, but the idea that what's happening happening now she might not care about in the future isn't something that she wants to think about. I'd say it's the concept of carpe diem, but with more of an emotional tint to it. To live a rose-colored life is to experience the high highs, the moments of joy and laughter of hanging with your friends, but then also the low lows that come with it, the darker shades of sadness and uncertainty. Sekitani Jun was dyed in the sharpest rose-colored shade imaginable, so that when tragedy struck, the counter low was arguably worse than being named the leader of the movement and achieving their victory in the first place. The same could be said for the librarian, who doesn't look back on the movement fondly, as the cost was just too high. Satoshi at one point says that that period just isn't a world they could imagine in the present. And I think that's true for the degree to which this rose-colored life was magnified as well. No one in Hyouka is going to get into trouble that might get them expelled, but there will be times of heartbreak and feeling of worthlessness, even as they're enjoying the moment-to-moment bike ride through the countryside or solving mysteries. And I think the solution to why Hyouka is named Hyouka is supposed to be an ever-present reminder of that duality. Ice cream is fun. It's lighthearted and generally associated with happy moments. But the flip side, I scream, is a cold indicator that those happy moments will be accompanied by moments of sadness. Like Chitanda after finding the anthologies is so excited, but the next moment she's almost on the verge of tears as she's concerned that she'll meet with despair if she seeks out the past. Or the inherent melancholy nature of her remembering what her uncle said to her. This sad memory that brings her to tears as she smiles, thankful that she was able to remember. Hyouka is, in that way, the embodiment of that high school life. And Hotaro's letter to his sister is a nice summation of where he stands now, and our last bookend. He's still interested in a rose-colored life. He's still making his way slowly towards it, but because of what happened to Sekitani Jun, the tragic story of a hero who was dyed far too deeply, he believes that relative to that, his gray life is better. Does that mean he's foregoing a rose-colored life entirely? Of course not, because he's glad that he's joined the Classics Club, since he signs off the letter with, "Thanks for the advice." And as he responds to Chitanda's statement that she doesn't want to think that things in the present won't matter to her in the future, he says, "It's the same for me too," over a beautiful shot of the sky with a little bit of gray and some deep gold shades. I wanted to talk about time in the Sekitani Jun arc, but unfortunately I feel like I've taken up too much of that so far, and since it's only peripherally related to what I discussed here, I'm going to save it for another video. We hit 1,000 subscribers the other day, so I wanted to acknowledge all of you who have contributed to that accomplishment, and to those watching who haven't, if you enjoyed this video, maybe consider it. We'll be back soon with more analysis and a new attention span, but until then, and as always, thanks for watching.